GNWT, the Honorable Shane Thompson, will be here and is here. Welcome, Shane, our Mr. Minister. And I'd like to, before we get started, we'll just introduce ourselves for the record.
Good afternoon, everyone. Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Kevin Riley, Frame Lake.
Jane Whalen Armstrong, MLA for Mulphy.
Thank you. Jackie Jacobson, Chair of the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment, member for Nunavut. Mr. Minister, would you like to introduce your staff?
You want me to do my opening comments too at the same time?
You could restart your opening comments, yes.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, sitting on my right, closest to me is Assistant Deputy Minister Julian Canagan. The far right is Director of Environment and Protection and Waste Management, Yip Young. Behind me is Manager of Legislation and Legal Affairs, Christine Glowich. And right behind her is Advisor of Legislation and Legal Affairs, Logan McKay, as well as my Ministerial Special Advisor, Jeff Ray.
Welcome, everybody. Mr. Minister, proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to introduce the Waste Reduction and Resource Recovery Act bill to the Standing Committee of Economic Development and Environment. This bill represents a significant step forward in modernizing the Waste Reduction and Recovery Act. It allows the GNWT to use the most current tools to effectively manage waste reduction and recovery in NWT. One of the key aspects of this bill is alignment with other GNWT legislation in interjurisdictional programs and services. These amendments will ensure an aligned approach towards waste management across various sectors. The bill includes important additions such as enabling extending producers' responsibility program and disposable ban. These tools will support our efforts to enhance waste reduction and recycling in NWT. In addition to these new tools, the bill also updates various aspects of administration, compliance, and enforcement penalties and regulation making authority. It is worth noting that amending the Waste Reduction and Recovery Act is a priority action under the Northwest Territories Waste Resource Management Strategy and Implementation Plan. The drafting of the bill was informed by targeted and group engagement that took place between May 2022 and January 2023. ECC looks forward to working with committee to ensure this modernized legislation is passed in this Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your opening remarks, Mr. Minister. Members, do you have any questions for the Minister on the bill? 78. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So, full disclosure, I was on the Waste Reduction and Recovery Advisory Committee from 2004 to 2015. I served as chair for a number of years as well. Section 4 of the Act is about agreements that the Minister can make. And of course, these can cover a whole variety of areas, but including provincial, other territorial governments, Indigenous governments, municipal governments, so on. So, but nowhere in that section or anywhere else in the Act can I find whether these agreements are public. So can I find out whether these agreements would be public documents and where would somebody find them? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister.
Thank you. Yes, they will be made public. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. And where would someone find them then? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister.
That detail, I'll turn to Mr. Kendall.
Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we were going to negotiate an agreement, there would be an engagement with stakeholders, and that's one way that folks would have input. And then afterwards, likely an agreement would be posted on our website, the ECC website.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I appreciate what you folks do. The lens that I always bring to these bills is something public, and it should be in the bill if it says that if the intention is to make it public, and there should be a place for these things to be found. And the minister well knows that that's exactly the same lens that I've brought to the Forest Act, to all the resource management legislation in the last assembly. So that's the lens that I use when I look at these things, is because I think by design we should be making sure that we have open government. That's what the open government policy actually says, but we just don't seem to implement it. Would the minister be agreeable then to having some sort of an amendment to the bill that would say that these agreements would be public once completed, and that there'd be a place where they could be found? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister?
Yeah, I can make the commitment that we'll consider it. We'll look at it. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Minister. Next on the list, I have Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oh, I got these back on. Yeah, no, I think this is really good. I'm glad to see that we're getting legislation around that, and I'm glad to see that it's not something where all of this is coming at once, and we're just trying to get the tools in place so that we can do future programs. And I am old enough to remember when the bottle recycling all started happening, and the incentivization for that and such. And so I guess my question has to do with how, going forward, if it's small communities and such that are going to end up sort of bearing some costs around these types of programs. And I'm wondering, given that we're already sort of really strapped, or, you know, a lot of those communities are operating from a deficit, at some point will it be looked at when the regulations are made, whether or not they're affordable to communities and stakeholders, and if not, to certain areas or groups, given, say, that they're on barging and such, will there be subsidies coming for that, or help from the government to pay, or offsets of those fees? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Minister?
A detail turn to Mr. Kennigan.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Kennigan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've definitely thought about this in creating the bill. And really, I guess a response to that is that the creation of more waste reduction and recovery programs would be anticipated to be a net benefit to communities. So when waste is prevented or diverted through reuse or recycling, then less waste is going to landfills for communities to manage. There's also a number of jobs, both full-time and part-time, associated with managing these programs. And it means less cost to communities for managing items, including products that they would send, like hazardous materials that would be needed to send south for proper management at a registered facility. All that to say, if we were to consider new regulations under the Act, there would be extensive engagement, particularly with communities, and we do have small communities represented on our Waste Recovery Committee in order to understand those perspectives and make sure that programs are designed with those in mind. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Kennigan. Amanda, Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I do, appreciate that there would be a process that would come around this. I guess my question is about if we are, like, one of the things mentioned is sort of the items that are ending up in landfills. And I know that, say, for example, Hay River has had a lot of issues in the past managing the landfill because of fire and such, and we're obviously facing more fires. So how is the state of the landfills at the start of all of this? Like, will there be, I guess, where is the program at for removing some of those hazardous materials? And if a community is already sort of starting there, like, are they going to be sort of expected to go in and clean that up ahead of any of these types of programs? Like, for example, if there's a bunch of batteries in a landfill and you put a battery recycling program in, how does the historic waste sort of get dealt with, I guess? Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Kennigan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. You may know that MACA and ECC are in a collaborative process where we do have funding from the federal government and are working with communities to actively backfill and like identify, package, and then backfill hazardous materials from landfills. And then the next stage is to make sure that there's systems in place that those kind of materials don't stack up again in our landfills. So there is a process going on. And then the other piece would be, again, if we were to develop regulations with respect to recycling for a new material, as we plan to for, say, used oil or tires or more electronic products, we're going to go back and engage with stakeholders to understand what those limitations are before anything is implemented.
County, next on this, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's a good piece of legislation. It modernizes. It's largely enabling. I understand a lot of the details will be done in regulations, so I don't have any substantive questions. But I have brought it up before that I believe there was intentions to create a satellite recycling station. I believe the license is due to go out for tender again, and perhaps that was one of the triggers. Any update on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Cannigan.
Thanks for the question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've definitely done some work on looking at the feasibility of a CCAN that could be modified in order to be a satellite depot. And I'm happy to say that that was a success, and it is something that's feasible. The next stage that we need to work on is finding the right location. And the right location needs to be somewhere that's accessible to those that would use the depot. And so there's further conversations that we need to have with the City of Yellowknife in order to understand where the best site would be. And potentially after that, there would need to be a zoning process to make sure that it's the right zoning. Thank you.
Mr. Cannigan, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. You know, this actually started with I was walking along the Frame Tree Lake Trail, and there's a guy who picks up my bottles for me because I don't return them to the depot, and he walks, you know, all year round at least once a week to the recycling depot on the other side of town, and that's the way he collects the empties, and it just seemed like a very easy. And I've since had conversations with people who don't have cars who are elderly downtown, and it's one of those just weird things. They struggle to get to the bottle depot, so I would like to see this. I think it's a small little gesture. I'm glad to be feasible. I guess in the form of a question, could we perhaps get some sort of timeline on that? You know, we got to put a CCAN somewhere and ask the city for permission. I like to think that's not going to take another 5 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Cannigan.
Yeah.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thanks. That's a conversation we're going to have with the city. We need to work with them. I guess, like Julian said, or Mr. Cannigan said, said when we were, again, it's about zoning, it's bylaws, it's that there's a whole bunch of little hiccups that we think we are good with. So unfortunately, we can't give you a complete deadline right now, but once we're able to, we will make sure committee is aware of that. Thank you.
Mr. Minister, next on the list I have Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it's good, you know, this Waste Management Recovery Act. But I just wanted to ask, I know the Indigenous government were probably consulted to, did you guys get any feedback from the Indigenous government? Is there any feedback or anything like that from the Indigenous government?
Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Mr. Minister.
For that detail, I'll turn to Mr. Cannigan.
Mr. Cannigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there was a few ways in which we received feedback on the bill, and one is through our Waste Reduction and Recovery Advisory Committee. And that advisory committee consists of 7 members right now, and they kind of reflect the demographics of the NWT and sectors and organizations, including like retailers, distributors, manufacturers, environmental organizations, community governments, the public, waste haulers, as well as ECC and MACA. So while that doesn't include Indigenous governments directly, it's a group of stakeholders that have an interest and in some cases a business with respect to waste management. And then the other way that we received feedback was through an information letter right to Indigenous governments and organizations. And some of that work is summarized in our What We Heard report.
Yep. Mr. Canigan, Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. Also, I just wanted to ask too, how this act, this Waste Management Act, will have an impact on Indigenous land claim groups, especially in the NWT. We have Clicho government, Clicho land claims. There's three parts to Clicho land claims, okay? There's the community government, which is the MACA, like funded. And there's the Clicho lands, and there's that Mufi boundary. And there's that SAT2, settlement land claim area. So I just wanted to know if this act will have an impact on the Indigenous self-government.
Yep. Thank you, Mrs. Whalen Armstrong. Mr. Canigan or Mr. Minister?
Thank you. Yeah. So the department has reached out to legal, and we did our consultation, and the information that we've received is that there will have no impact on the rights-based Indigenous groups. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Minister. Next on the list, I have Ms. Knockaby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My next question is just, or one question I have is, there was a comment, and I know this is how it works, where a lot of our hazardous waste has to go to, say, Alberta, like Swan Hills, places like that. And there's often that question of balancing out the removal of materials versus, maybe burying in situ, things like that. So my question is, knowing that Giant Mine has a bunch of issues being needed where there's pits that need to be filled that will eventually be frozen, there is a hazardous materials site designated or place designated. I'm curious to know if there's any opportunity for us to be using Giant and its remediation and its infill needs in order to backfill, you make me laugh, in order to, cut down the distance that we would have to take some of our materials out, which actually then would allow us probably to recycle more, or to, not recycle, sorry, but dispose of more things out of the communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Knockaby, Mr. Canigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're thinking along the same lines that we were with respect to accepted waste sites and thinking about where that eventual mine waste could go. Unfortunately, with respect to the Giant Mine, all of that area that they have for disposal is spoken for with respect to the Giant Mine waste. So unfortunately, the answer is no. That's not an option for us at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Canigan. Ms. Knockaby.
I'm just and I believe you, it's not, I'm not trying to question that, but I'm just curious, has there actually been a real study done of the amount of the materials? Because it was my understanding they are going to need to source a lot of materials, and I do get that a lot of that can't necessarily be hazardous waste, but I'm just feeling like there must be some way to be utilizing that site, given that, for example, in the central pond, they've already buried or placed a whole bunch of sea cans of waste material for some of the deconstruction of the mill. So I guess this is probably a bigger conversation than this bill, but maybe one I will pursue down the line or offline. Thank you. Yeah.
Ms. Knockaby, Mr. Minister, and reply. Mr.
Canigan, this is way in depth.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We'd be happy to have an offline conversation with you about that, and the management of the Giant Mine site. Being a partner on the project team, we have insight into the management, and happy to share.
Thank you, Mr. Canigan. Yeah. Next on the list, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So just wanted to follow up on my colleague about another depot in Yellowknife. The minister knows I've raised this at least twice through correspondence and on the floor of the House, but I'm just going to tell you a little story. I went to Nuuk, Greenland in 2015, 2016, and I was walking around this in sort of a bit of an indoor mall, and I'm looking at this machine that's kind of mounted on a wall. And what you do is you push a bottle into it, and it accepts it, and cash comes out of a little tray. Like, this is not rocket science, folks. Like, they can do it in Nuuk. So I don't understand why we can't have a second depot somewhere in Yellowknife, or at least some sort of system that allows people to do this a little more easily than taking, their truckloads of stuff to the depot and having to get a number and line up. And like, I've done the whole shtick. So if they can do it in Nuuk, Greenland, can we not do something a little better here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Riley. Mr. Minister.
Detail, I'll turn to Ms. Young, please.
Mr. Minister, Ms. Young.
Thank you for the question, Kevin. We did look into that. It's called a reverse vending machine, essentially. And the issue with that is that it's not a very big space for storage. And when we were looking at a downtown location, what we found that would be the most feasible would be a large sea can where people can drop off, similar to what a drop and go at the existing depot would be. And we found that that would be more feasible than doing a reverse vending machine. And they're quite expensive as well, I think, but they're just not very big, and you can't put very many cans in there as opposed to a larger sea can.
Ms. Young. Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, well, yeah, I think that technology's probably evolved even beyond what I saw, but I'm sure we can do better, and I look forward to a second place in Yellowknife where people can do the recycling. But I want to move on, Mr. Chair. So Section 5, though, of the bill talks about the waste reduction and recovery advisory committee. And look, before I go any further, these guys at the department do a great job on this. I want to give them lots of credit. It's we've done an amazing job in terms of getting stuff out of landfills, recyclable bottles, cans, and I think we're going to move towards batteries and some other tires and stuff that should not be going into landfills. So it's great work that these folks do, and having served on the advisory committee, I can attest to the level of advice and insights and things that those folks provide, and it's a very collaborative thing. So, but I'm worried because the bill says, and this is a repeal in place bill, so the old bill's gone, this doesn't really change it, but the bill before us says the minister may establish an advisory committee. Can we not get something a little bit more stronger than may? Something like the minister shall? Because I really think that having this committee is an important way of ensuring that there's some collaboration with different orders of government, different interests, perspectives, sets of experience. So just having this as an optional thing is not a good idea. I think it should be required. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Minister?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's exactly the same wording in the previous bill. It's in there. So right now I can tell you we have no intentions not to do it, but it's also when we talk to legal about it, and this is the wording legal has come, but I know that committee will most likely come to it and we'll look into it, like we'll honestly look into it further. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Ms. Knockleby.
I'm going to go back down the bottle depot wormhole for a quick question. Just something about it when it was commented that it would be a drop and go. Does that mean then that people would not be paid immediately when they drop the bottles off? Because if that is the case, well, that's what I'm asking. So if that were the case, then people would obviously would not want to leave their bottles and not get paid immediately. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Canigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. So there's a lot of, I guess, factors that go into considering what a downtown bottle depot would look like. And the reason we came to the conclusion that drop and go would probably be the best is just having cash on site would likely be a concern. And so having something where there's a delay, I'd recognize between like putting the bottles in and getting the cash out is a concern, but for us was overweighed by that that need to have the cash there and potentially have an attendant presence a lot of that time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You can, Mr. Knockleby?
So then that means that the payout would be of some sort of check or deposit to people's bank accounts, which means vulnerable people will not have access to using this. So that's a problem, I think, that does need to be addressed. I mean, maybe we could look at something to the effect of it goes next to the police station, if we're really going to find a spot for it, or and you know, I really think that if that is the case and how it is set up, it will again only end up being used by, you know, more of the middle class people like myself who maybe don't right now do the same thing as my colleague was saying, just let others recycle. Maybe I'll come and throw a bag in there. But the people that I believe this is intended for is the people that are walking around with big bags full, and they aren't going to be comfortable with that. So, and a lot won't have a bank account or an ability to cash a check. So you're going to have either then we'd have to have a depot or some place with money elsewhere anyway. So I would just think this would be something better to address now before we get to that stage. Thank you.
It's not going to be Mr. Cannigan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that will be something that we have to take into consideration. And I appreciate the member bringing it forward. I mean, it's something that we've looked at, but we will further look into it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Okay, next on this, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So once again, I'm kind of bringing my public lens to the bill. And I noticed that, so Part 4, there's provision for disposal bans and prohibited materials. And for the minister, or sorry, I guess it's the cabinet to make regulations to basically ban stuff from going into landfills and then prohibiting some material that could go in, if I'm reading this right. But the interesting part is that for the prohibited materials, there's a subsection 3 that requires notice of the regulations be given by means of publication on a website, by radio and television broadcasts, or a combination of these. But there's nothing like that when it comes to disposal bans. So can someone explain to me why there's not a similar provision for some kind of public communications around disposal bans versus prohibited material? Maybe there's a good explanation, but I guess I'd like to receive that, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly, Mr. Cannigan.
Mr. Chair, I think the simple explanation is if we were going to think about developing a waste disposal ban, then it would involve a regulation process, regulation development, and there would be engagement along with that. So there would be a lot of notice through the engagement with stakeholders before we ever got to a point where that regulation was in place and there was actually a waste disposal ban. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cannigan, Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, okay. I think the same thing, though, might be required with prohibited material. And I guess I'd like to see the same public notice kind of provision for disposal bans as is currently in the bill for prohibited materials. You know, if we're going to do it for one, why are we not doing it for the other one? So that's more of a comment, and maybe that's something committee can consider when we look at whether we want to propose amendments to the bill or not. So, but look, I think this is a good bill. There's lots of great improvements in here, especially in terms of extended producer responsibility stuff. This is really important work, and I want to compliment the department and the minister for bringing this forward. This is kind of like the next level for us to move into these areas, which is what many of the provinces are doing. So this is good work, and the things that I've suggested are really minor tweaks, quite frankly. So I appreciate the work. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Minister, you want to add anything? Any other questions from the members? No other questions? Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
No, I just wanted to ask, well, especially for small communities, I just wanted to ask how will the smaller community be able to implement this new EPR program, and how is it going to be regulated and supported in the whole process?
Armstrong, Mr. Cannigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. So I think getting to a point where we have extended producer responsibility would involve a lot of conversation with communities and with industry and with waste haulers and so on before we ever got to a point where we would be implementing a program like that. Because like you mentioned, it would have an impact on how things are done now. So the way that our recycling system set up now, Safe for Bottles, is that the government is really doing that work, and it's happening after the fact, after the product's been bought, sold, and the consumer has the choice to either throw it in the garbage or recycle it. Whereas there could be advantages to having extended producer responsibility where, say, the fee for that comes off, when you buy the product, and then there isn't an option to put it into a landfill. Instead, there's a place where you can take it back to. And instead of it being government that's responsible for managing that, it would be in the hands of the producer. And that doesn't necessarily mean like it's in the hands of the, like a Canadian Tire or something like that. There might be like a national organization that's behind stores here being able to take something in, like a tire, for example. And so in that way, it can kind of put the responsibility back on the producer, maybe to change the way that they produce the product so that it's more reusable when they do get it back, or it has less wasteful packaging on it. And so the idea, I guess, is to try to improve the circularity of the economy so that we're producing less waste overall, and we're getting more of the used things going back into our economy and then coming around and being sold again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cannigan, Ms. Whalen Armstrong.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's good to know, because you know that I said it today. Community governments, we do need more resources to help us in this whole process. It's not just in my community. It could be in the higher Arctic. In Nunukput and all those other areas, smaller communities. We do need more resources. So, and small community governments are underfunded. So that's why I just wanted to know how it's going to be regulated and supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Whalen Armstrong. Okay, good. Any other questions from the members? Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I fibbed. I have one more. And this may just be my lack of understanding this, but the Environment Fund, I know that there's an annual report tabled in the House that talks about money in, money out, and that we do tend to get a schedule or a page in the main estimates, or the public accounts is a bit fuzzy in my mind right now, that kind of outlines the money in, money out kind of aspect of this. But there's nothing in the bill itself that requires this to happen. There's no public reporting requirement. And I don't know whether this is because of, maybe that's a requirement of subsection 1.1 of the Financial Administration Act. But if it's covered under the Financial Administration Act, I'm fine. But if it's not, then I would like to suggest that there be a requirement for public reporting. That's just transparency. It's good to know where the environmental fund is at. You don't want to build, and I don't have to tell you guys this, you don't want the fund building up too much because we're collecting too many deposits and things. The idea is to kind of even it out so that eventually it pays for itself, and that we use the resources to hire staff and get the stuff diverted from landfills and recycled. So anyways, I'm just curious as to why there's no public reporting requirement, whether that's already covered in this reference to the Financial Administration Act. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Reilly, Mr. Cannigan.
Mr. Chair, so we agree, and it just happens that the way this legislation is set up, that the requirement for public reporting and the audited financial statements in the regulation rather than the act. So if you went to the existing regulations, that's where that reporting piece is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cannigan. Any other questions, Mr. O'Reilly? Members? Seeing nobody else who wishes to speak today, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Committee will continue to work on Bill 78 over the next few weeks, and if there's anybody watching and wishes to provide feedback, committee is still accepting written submissions. Submissions could be emailed to committee@ntassembly.ca. This concludes the public hearing today here. Thank the minister and the staff for coming in with all information, really informative, and one of the best meetings yet you've done. We're getting all the answers that we wanted. So thank you, Mr. Minister. You guys have a good evening. Good evening, everybody.